Hello, Facebook. Welcome to this ratification day event. I am excited to have folks with us here this evening. We are just getting going. I am Bonnie Bird, the Executive Director at the Waukesha County Historical Society and Museum, and I've got some guests with us here this evening. So I'm going to bring them in, but we are going to wait a couple minutes. I see a couple folks starting to tune in here, so we're going to see who all we can get to join us. Or if you're watching after the fact, welcome. Glad to have you. So first I'm bringing up Vicki Arrow-Shackmuth. She is the director at the League of Women Voters, Milwaukee County, Waukesha County branch. Vicki, good to see you again today.
Good to see you.
I know she and I we did not break our quarantine. We did a socially distant event earlier today at the museum.
It was a wonderful event, yes.
Yeah, really, really excited to be able to partner again this year with you and with the League. You guys are celebrating your own 100-year anniversary this year, which is not coincidental to our larger suffrage celebrations.
That's correct.
So if you missed it earlier today, we passed out suffrage celebration kits, bags that were full of all sorts of crafts and activities to do, as well as some information, incredibly valuable information from the League of Women Voters about how you can make sure you are registered, if you need an absentee ballot, how to make sure that's happening, anything and everything you needed in one quick little snapshot card. Vicki, I don't know if you wanted to say anything about that quickly while we would get going here.
Just that the League has these cards available for other organizations. If they're looking for any voter information, they can contact the League. We'd love to offer these cards for other organizations.
Absolutely tremendous. And again, those were in the bags we handed out today. Those are still available at the Historic Society and Museum if you do want to stop in and visit us sometime. We are open on Thursday afternoons 1 to 4, Friday afternoons 1 to 4, Saturdays 10 to 4. Please do wear your face mask when you're coming in, although we've got some free face masks to pass out as well when you stop in, made by some of our community volunteers, again, to honor women's suffrage. So in these suffrage colors of purple and yellow in Wisconsin especially. I've got my other side yellow tunic pinned behind me, a reproduction. I did not steal that from the museum, so nobody turned me into myself for damaging artifacts. But I see we've got a number of folks joining us on Facebook. Welcome and thank you to you all. We are also broadcasting on YouTube tonight. If you're watching us on YouTube, welcome. A couple of housekeeping things to go over because I don't want to waste any more time before the main show. We are all broadcasting from our homes here tonight, so do forgive us for any technical difficulties. We are going to do our best to bring things back should they drop out. We've done some dress rehearsals and had to kind of jump back in, so just be patient with us. We've got two, again, both the Waukesha County Historic Society and Museum and the League of Women Voters, Milwaukee County, Waukesha County branch sponsoring tonight's event. And really want to thank all of you tuning in on behalf of both of our organizations. We are community-based organizations. We serve you guys. Without you and your interest in our programs, without your support of our programs and initiatives, we would not be here. So a huge thank you to all of you. I will drop into the background here, but before I go, I am going to pull up our keynote speaker for the evening. I am wonderfully excited that we are able to host Dr. Genevieve McBride, adding her to the stream. She is the author of On Wisconsin Women, Professor Emeritus at UW-Milwaukee, and a huge inspiration to hundreds, if not thousands, I think at this point, of historians who have read her work and studied. I am wonderfully excited that we are able to host Dr. Genevieve McBride. I hear a bit of an echo. We'll try and take care of those things. I am going to drop out, though, and throw over to Vicki for a more official introduction.
Well, welcome and good evening, everyone. My name is Vicki Arrow-Shackmuth, as Bonnie has mentioned, and I have the pleasure of serving as the director of the League of Women Voters of Milwaukee County, the Waukesha County branch. The League is serving as the co-host of today's event on Wisconsin, celebrating 100 years of the 19th Amendment, along with the Waukesha Historical Society and Museum. Thank you for joining us today as August 18th, 2020 marks the 100th year passing of the 19th Amendment, guaranteeing women the right to vote and protecting women's constitutional right to vote. On August 18, 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, making women's suffrage legal in the United States. On August 26, 1920, 8 days after it had been ratified, the 19th Amendment was declared in effect by Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby, giving female citizens the right to vote in all American elections, which in recent history has been declared Women's Equality Day. The 19th Amendment also marked the largest expansion of democracy in the history of our country. We know the 19th Amendment left behind women. It left women of color behind, Black women, Indigenous women, and Asian American women. It wouldn't be until 1965's Federal Voters' Right Act that everyone had the right to vote. It is important to reflect on these historic events and to explore their relevance today. The League of Women Voters was born out of the suffrage movement and was founded February 14th, 1920. We celebrated, as Bonnie mentioned, our 100th anniversary this year at an in-person event at the Waukesha Historical Society and Museum. The League was formed as a natural transition from a movement to obtain women's suffrage or the right to vote to an organization dedicated to encouraging all people to become informed voters and to engage with their elected representatives to promote better government. Throughout the past 100 years, members of the League of Women Voters have advanced and defended democracy and championed voting rights through civic engagement. The League's mission to empower voters and defend democracy is as vital today as it was at its founding. We have worked diligently against voter suppression with several recent state and federal lawsuits, informed voters with our 2020 Webby Award-winning Vote411.org voter guide. We register more voters than any other organization in the state on National Voter Registration Day and conduct public forums to keep the public informed. Sure, COVID-19 has slowed us down, but we are not deterred, nor should you. Our Waukesha branch, which only formed in the past 2 years, strives to meet the moment. As the New York Times recently wrote, if Wisconsin is the bellwether state for November's general election, then Waukesha County might be the most important area of the most important state. With voter suppression efforts reaching every community through things like voter ID requirements and gerrymandering, the League is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse or oppose political candidates, but we do defend democracy. The most recent efforts of slowing the U.S. Postal Service mail by holding up funding, removing sorting machines and mail collection boxes, all in an effort to disenfranchise voters, is an effort against democracy, and we have our work cut out for us. Our efforts to defend democracy and empower voters is as vital today as it was at our founding. If you're looking for more information on the League or the 19th Amendment, we have events going on through August 26th with additional information on our website. Visit our website at lwvmilwaukee.org or visit the Waukesha Historical Society's website at wchsm.org. Both are also active on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Now to move on to what we are all here for. Our presentation on Wisconsin, celebrating 100 years of the 19th Amendment by Dr. Genevieve McBride, Professor Emerita of History at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Dr. McBride will trace women's work and reform movements in the state's politics and press. Dr. McBride is an author of books that span Wisconsin women's history from pre-settlement to the present. She is editor of the anthology Women's Wisconsin, From Native Matriarchies to the New Millennium, which opens 400 years ago with the story of the women chief of the Ho-Chunk. She is co-author of Dear Mrs. Griggs, Women Pour Out Their Hearts in the Heartland, on everyday lives of women in a working class city in the Midwest. And she is the author of the award-winning On Wisconsin Women, Working for Their Rights from Settlement to Suffrage, which she will discuss with us today. She also has published several articles in the State Historical Society's magazines in Wisconsin and in Illinois. And she has contributed book chapters to several volumes, including on the history of Milwaukee's Black press and on the next campaign by state suffragists after their historic ratification of the 19th Amendment, called Forward Women, winning the Wisconsin campaign for the country's first ERA in 1921. A native of Milwaukee, McBride began her career in the city's Black press and worked for the Milwaukee Journal, the Milwaukee Sentinel, and the Waukesha Freeman, as well as in public relations for the state's oldest college, Carroll, before earning her master's degree at Marquette University and her doctorate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She also taught at UW-Milwaukee, at Carroll, Marquette, UW-Waukesha, and UW-Madison, and then settled at UW-Milwaukee for more than 3 decades. At UW-Milwaukee, she created courses in women's history as well as in Midwestern history, and was a founder of the Midwestern History Association until her retirement in 2017. She has served on the board of curators of the State Historical Society, and she was a founding member of the only one from Wisconsin, of the Academic Advisory Board of the National Museum of Women's History in Washington, D.C., and for the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. She now serves as an expert resource, again, the only one from Wisconsin, for the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission on the history of the campaign that we commemorate today. This concludes my portion of today's event, and I turn things over to Dr. McBride for our extraordinary program. So sit back and enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to celebrate with you our centennial as the first state to officially ratify the 19th Amendment last year in Wisconsin, as we will see, and this year, the centennial of the amendment nationwide. It has been decades since I met some of you in Waukesha, since publication of this research for my first book. So I look forward to talking with you again about the work that women called the century of struggle. It was a century in the East, at least. However, in this state, our story started with statehood in 1848, a pivotal year in the history of Wisconsin and in the histories of women here and nationwide and worldwide. Eastern women who had migrated here had brought west their American dream of full citizenship, which actually had existed here for the first women, our Native American women, when Wisconsin, as Vicki noted, actually had a woman chief, Hopekawika of the Ho-Chunk. We have not accomplished that since, as we've only made it as far as lieutenant governor for women in Wisconsin. Women also had full citizenship here under French law for French, Canadian, and Métis women here, like Josette Vaux-Junot, the founding mother of Milwaukee. But by then, women here had lost their property rights when their lands were lost to the newcomer Americans, whose Declaration of Independence had asserted only that all men were created equal. However, women held hope that the courts would rule for their rights under the Constitution, which made no mention of gender then. Nor would the Wisconsin Constitution when we finally won statehood in 1848. 2 years before, in 1846, the voters of the territory, the men, had rejected a first draft of a state constitution for us and had deferred Wisconsin statehood after a divisive debate on reform, including women's rights. That had doomed our first attempt at statehood. As historian Louise Phelps Kellogg of Madison wrote, and I quote, "That debate raged for several days among men, many of whom were advanced thinkers on social questions. However, on the subject of suffrage for freedmen or former slaves, a less advanced speaker among the men suggested the result of such foolishness." As she writes, he had the reputation of being a wag who raised the specter of women's suffrage only for comic relief. So, as she wrote, and I quote, "There was no serious consideration of women's suffrage, but only ridicule to show how preposterous it was. But because married women's property rights did survive debate for our first try at statehood, that attempt failed. And so our second attempt at a constitution included no such foolishness as rights for women in 1848, when they already had waited 72 years since the Declaration of Independence to win their own, and they would wait 72 years more." But elsewhere, a few months later in 1848, and a few Great Lakes to the east in upstate New York, the women's rights movement was born, with the first women's rights convention in the world. Women there in Seneca Falls, New York, included Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who organized the convention and drafted a document modeled on the Men's Declaration to start the next revolution for women. As she wrote, and I quote from her historic Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls, "Women could anticipate no small amount of misconception, misrepresentation, and ridicule for decades to come, until they would win the 19th Amendment to the Constitution at last. And at least, as her historic document lists dozens of rights to be won, and some are not yet won for women today." Now, that the first state to ratify that amendment would be Wisconsin is a complex story. That women's rights and freed men's suffrage and temperance too all were on Wisconsin's political agenda even before statehood seemed promising. However, that none of these reforms was adopted here in 1848 suggests the magnitude of the reform campaigns to follow for the 13th, 14th, 15th, 18th, and then 19th Amendments, which were so numbered because the last one to be won for women's suffrage would be the reform that was hardest fought and subjected to the most misrepresentation and ridicule, especially in Wisconsin. First, for nearly 2 decades from Seneca Falls through the Civil War, women suffragists here deferred their own cause for the urgency of ending slavery and the urgent needs of men in wartime. But here nationwide, women cared for all casualties of war through their abolition societies and then their soldiers' aid societies. Women cared for war widows and war orphans as well as wounded men. In this state, in Milwaukee, women raised funds for supplies and for a Water Street storefront where they cared for 30,000 men wounded in the war and for years afterward, until the federal government finally took responsibility and also took the land that women bought with their bake sales and craft fairs, the land for the first federal veterans hospital and soldiers home in this country, in Milwaukee. Women had deferred their own cause during the war with the understanding that the men in reform would work for universal suffrage, which means for women as well as freedmen, once abolition was won. So, women helped to found the Equal Rights Association. And at its meeting in 1866, men shared the podium with Katie Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and a movement newcomer making her first stand for suffrage. A decade later, the Reverend Olympia Brown would move to this state, and more than 5 decades later, she would be the only one of the women on that podium in 1866, the only survivor of that first generation of suffrage leaders to live to vote in 1920. The struggle would take so long because the same men in reform who had sought women's support for decades and throughout the war, and then for the 14th and 15th Amendments, then actually wrote women out of the Constitution with, for the first time, the inclusion of the word male in those amendments in 1868. That ended early woman suffragists' hope for resort to the courts. Now, a new constitutional amendment was needed. So, in 1869, Anthony and Katie Stanton went on tour to the West to organize women, as well as in the East. They came to our first statewide woman suffrage convention, organized by women in Milwaukee, a comparative mecca for the few women in Wisconsin in the professions then, including a minister, a law student, an editor, and a publisher, until men here formed the state's first union to boycott her newspaper. Another woman was the third woman graduate from the first medical school for women and the first woman physician in Wisconsin. However, men in our medical society had denied her admission for decades. But before the year's end, she became a member by marrying its president. But first, Dr. Laura Ross Wolcott became the first president of the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association, which would survive by that name for 50 years to win the 19th Amendment here. And it survives today because, as we noted, the League of Women Voters really began that day when a standing room only crowd met in Milwaukee's City Hall to see Anthony, Katie Stanton, and other women actually speak in public. One in the crowd became a well-known editor who later wrote, and I quote, that as a lad, he had strayed into the convention, but had to flatten himself against the wall because the chairs all were occupied, mostly by the ladies. Gentlemen of the press were present because the Milwaukee Sentinel published proceedings, and another newspaper noted the event by editorially refuting public suspicion that the event drew, as the editor wrote, and I quote, only that class of women known as strong-minded. And in their own suffrage newspaper called The Revolution, Katie Stanton and Anthony wrote, and I quote, that Milwaukee papers teem with accounts, most often friendly, even if entirely opposed to the object under consideration, as they all were. Their report included coverage of their reception in Madison, too, where Anthony became the first woman to speak in our state capitol. She was to speak in support of a bill for limited only school suffrage, but some legislators had brought up the bill early to defeat it the day before. Madison was not friendly for women, as Ross Wolcott wrote in the first of our state's reports for Katie Stanton and Anthony's first volume of their monumental 6-volume collection called The History of Woman Suffrage. Among many items in her report, Ross Wolcott wrote about the UW, which was to have been coeducational by then. But regents and legislators had relegated women students to a separate, less funded and inferior female college, as it was called. As Ross Wolcott wrote, and I quote, "That was one of many petty ways in which girls can be defrauded of their rights to a thorough education by narrow and bigoted men entrusted with a little brief authority." Some men read that in the UW as a job description, it seemed, when I was turned down for tenure in UW after I wrote this book. But in 1869, suffragists at least could look elsewhere for progress. In the West, Wyoming was the first state with full woman suffrage in 1869. And in the East, Matilda Arnica of Milwaukee addressed the major reform group, the Equal Rights Association. As an immigrant who had fled here for freedom, she pleaded in English and German with the men who were writing the women out of the Constitution. She said, "Don't exclude us. Don't exclude half of the human family from the ballot box, which is the people's holy palladium." Then the men called the women imprudent. And Annika replied that whether it be prudent to enfranchise women is not the question, only whether it be right. But when the equal rights reformers, the men, refused to support equal suffrage, women realized that they needed an organization and an amendment of their own. So Annika stayed on to represent our state when Anthony and Katie Stanton founded the first national woman suffrage organization that year, in 1869, which would outlive them to win the 19th Amendment more than half a century later. Elsewhere and in Wisconsin for the next 50 years, from 1869 to 1919, women without the vote were active in politics, at the forefront of reform campaigns, such as the Women's Temperance Crusade of 1873 and 74. Indeed, I was surprised to find in my research for this book that the first crusade was in this state. But where else would a temperance campaign be needed more? The movement here spread to enlist 150,000 women in every state and territory, who then founded the world's largest women's organization, the WCTU, whose president by 1880 was a suffragist, Frances Willard, from Janesville. She was in Illinois by then, but another leader still in Janesville was Lavinia Goodell, the first woman lawyer in Wisconsin, the only state where a state bar denied admission to a woman twice, as our Chief Justice denounced Goodell as, and I quote, "a traitor to her sex." By 1880, when she finally won her fight for admission to the state bar, Goodell could not go to court. She died 3 weeks later, at the age of 40. But a resurgence of suffragism also arose in this state in 1880, as Anthony and Katie Stanton returned here to lobby for a law at least allowing women to run for school superintendent seats. Women won, but lost allowing them to vote for themselves. Then came the battle for the ballot that would win and lose even the most limited suffrage here. That first woman suffrage referendum in this state was led by the organization founded in 1869, which by then was led by Olympia Brown in 1880. And women actually won the majority of voters, the men, who still were the only voters in this state. Had the 1886 referendum result stood, Wisconsin would have been one of the first states, apparently only the second state, with woman suffrage. Instead, it would be the state tied for last decades later. In 1888, 2 years after the referendum, when men actually voted for women's suffrage here, women lost a long and costly battle all the way to our state Supreme Court, when it ruled that the law was invalid until legislators first had to fix a little flaw in the law, which was caused by men's revision of the women's careful wording. Somehow, our state legislators would not find a way to fix the law for 15 years until a Waukesha woman showed them how, as we will see. But in the interim, the loss in the courts set back the state suffrage movement. It had gone broke with all the court costs. But the cause also was set back here by the State Suffrage Association's leader, Olympia Brown. She was bitter and became inactive, but refused to step down. So another movement of women would take over leadership of the cause in the 1890s, if they did so at first more quietly, as they were called, the ladies of the clubs. First came local clubs, then local civic federations under their motto of municipal housekeeping, and then a state federation led by influential women like Belle Case La Follette, who was her spouse's campaign manager and speechwriter, and graduated from the law school before he did. Indeed, when I found her speech to club women in 1896 at their first state convention here, that speech seemed familiar because her spouse would repeat it almost word for word in his famous inaugural speech as governor that set forth the progressive movement agenda 4 years later, the years that he called when we were governor. So, in a new century, club women led our state suffrage movement because they were led there by their new state president. Theodora Winton Youmans of Waukesha was a pioneering journalist who had covered women's causes since the 1880s at the Freeman, the newspaper that would become known as the Progressive Mouthpiece. She now led club women lobbying to win back at least part of the law that was lost after the 1886 state referendum. And under Youmans, club women statewide lobbied and won from the legislature limited school suffrage, voting only for school-related elections. It was enacted in 1902. Here and across the country, the middle-aged, middle-class ladies of the clubs became called the second generation of suffragists. They came to the campaign in its last decade in the millions. They were motivated by frustration with men's intransigence toward civic-minded women. As the future first president of our State League of Women Voters would put it, clubwoman Jessie Jack Hooper of Oshkosh said that she became a suffragist because women without the vote had, as she wrote, and I quote, only a teaspoon to try to move men toward progress, when only a steam shovel would do. But the women also became frustrated with Olympia Brown. So, clubwoman Ada James of Richland Center started a new suffrage organization in 1911 and recruited Winton Youmans to publicize another state referendum. But the results of our state's second women's suffrage referendum would make Wisconsin infamous among women nationwide. This time in 1912, when state after state elsewhere went for women's suffrage, Wisconsin men who had voted for it in 1886 now in 1912 voted against women's suffrage 2-1. Reasons for the resounding failure of the referendum were many, and most were caused by men's corrupt maneuvers, from liquor lobby bribery in the state where the liquor lobbying had been begun by the original Milwaukee brewers. From that to a state attorney general's last-minute order for separate pink referendum ballots. But above all, as a suffragist wrote, and I quote, "The last thing a man becomes progressive about in Wisconsin is the activities of his own wife." However, 1912 was a turning point nationwide when women in other states did win suffrage. Even here, women created awareness of their cause, which is a first step in any campaign, in ways that astonished politicians, the press, and the public. From 1911 on, the once well-mannered Wisconsin club women were in the news, owing to Winton Youmans, with her weekly Freeman Suffrage column that she syndicated statewide. Her coverage for decades before, as well as during that campaign and since, and the work of other women journalists before her here, comprised thousands of articles on microfilm, for the record that made my research possible. I read of tactics called suffrage stunts never seen in this state. From parades and colorful yellow regalia and purple sashes, excuse me, to the new movies, what immigrants called moving pictures, in the storefronts, or as they also were called, photoplays. And there were flyers in immigrants' many languages here, dropped by the new flying machines. And at a time when cars still were rare on our state roads, and few even were paved, Buffalo Bill Cody carried a suffrage banner as he rode his horse into Green Bay. But women careened from town to town in what they called motor tours, in cars covered in suffrage colors. Belle Case La Follette came back to the state to speak from the back seat of an automobile. Another woman was at a loss for words, as Youmans wrote, and I quote, "But she could drive an auto and play a cornet." And after her own motor tour, Winton Youmans wrote, and I quote, that the native badger experienced the destructive shock of seeing a woman stand up in an automobile on a street corner and plead for her political freedom. But colorful tactics could not substitute for cohesive strategy. And another turning point came as women realized that competing state suffrage organizations here, with the new one founded in 1911, that they needed to merge, and with new leadership. Instead of Brown or James, women elected Winton Youmans as the last president of our state suffragists. Fortunately, she continued her Freeman column and chronicled for us a time of conflict within the movement and the country, and nowhere more than Wisconsin as the most Germanic state in the country then. The European War, as it first was called, came here in 1914, sooner than in any state. Some suffragists here were immigrants, such as Sophie Gooden of Oshkosh. Others had German heritage, although born here, such as Meta Schlichting-Berger of Milwaukee. and the federal government persecuted her immigrant husband, who was denied his seat in Congress owing to their newspaper's stance for neutrality. Neutrality. While Belle Case La Follette's spouse faced impeachment in the Senate for his anti-war activism. And then, even as our state suffragists reunited, two newcomers to the national women's movement split it apart. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns trained in the militant British movement and then returned here as what the Europeans called suffragettes. But that is a diminutive and a gendered term, so it was not used by most women in this country, who would not be diminished and who welcomed men's support. So then, after years of conflict with the older organization, founded in 1869, Paul and Burns left it to start their National Woman's Party in 1915, just as the older organization was on the cusp of a resurgence, as Anthony's choice as successor returned again to its presidency. Carrie Chapman Catt, who was born here in Ripon, Wisconsin, was a brilliant strategist who led a massive effort to win women's suffrage in New York State, the most populous state, in time for the presidential election. Catt would enlist suffragists nationwide in support of President Wilson's war to win his support of suffrage, but that lost support of anti-war women. In Wisconsin, octogenarian Olympia Brown publicly repudiated Catt, and then Winton Youmans for supporting Catt. And Brown quit the state suffrage organization that she long had led since the 1880s, while Ada James and Maida Schlichtenberger and Belle Case La Follette, all anti-war, also again quit the older state suffrage organization, as they had in 1911, to join the newer one, the National Woman's Party. Their departures were a public and personal blow to Youmans, but the older state organization here may have benefited. Youmans lost divisive members repeatedly, and she gained a second in command as the first vice president of the State Suffrage Association to the end, Jessie Jack Hooper, who was an experienced and effective lobbyist. Suffragists nationwide also split over the National Woman's Party tactics, which were taken from the British movement, such as when they picketed the White House for suffrage. But Wilson claimed that they were protesting against the war. He had Paul and Burns and dozens of women imprisoned and tortured, an overreach by the White House that eventually won sympathy for women's cause. So Wilson finally met with the more moderate now of the suffrage leaders, or so it seemed. But Catt reminded him that millions of women in suffrage states had voted in 1916. They even had elected the first woman in Congress. And then, as most suffragists continued with Catt's plan to prove their patriotism in the war, they won more states to become a constituency sufficient to put political pressure on the president and Congress in the Electoral College. She had it figured out. So at last, at least congressmen and one congresswoman in the House, all up for re-election in 1918, saw a political purpose in passing the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, as it was known for its author before it became numbered. Now, Susan B. Anthony had written that amendment. It had been introduced as a bill in Congress by her nephew almost half a century before for the national centennial in 1876. Somehow, from 1876 to 1918, the men never could figure out how to bring it out of committee. But in 1918, when they did so, Cat called women to Washington to lobby their congressmen, while other women lobbied in their home states. So Winton Youmans went to Washington, D.C., while Jessie Jack Hooper stayed in this state to lobby in wintry Wisconsin. And Youmans and Hooper's moving correspondence that is cited in the classic history of the movement. Hooper wrote, and I quote, "I was frightfully tired from nervous and physical exhaustion as I traveled over a good deal of the districts in this state, not making public speeches, but seeing the men who were politically prominent. Some days I got up at 5:30, took an electric train, and did not get home until midnight, talking out the question with 6 to 8 men and going from office to office all during the day. I worked up until the last moment, until I knew nothing more could reach Washington. And then I gave it up." However, as Hooper wrote, she was not complaining. She wrote, "I would do it all again to get the results, even if I were in bed for 6 months." She said that she had been sure of 6 votes from this state and hoped for 7 of the 11 congressmen then from Wisconsin. However, Hooper snared not just 7, but one more for 8 votes from this state toward the total in the House that, with 2/3 required for constitutional amendments, passed the House by 1 vote. It might have been that vote from Wisconsin. But many histories credit 4 men in Congress who came from sick beds, whether their own or their wives'. One woman told her husband to go to Washington and he would return for her funeral. However, first, from the House galleries, he already could hear a familiar hymn. As Winton Youmans wrote, and I quote, "She and others seated behind the sign that said Mrs. Cat's Ladies celebrated with a spontaneous hymn sing of the doxology. However, the House vote was only the first hurdle. Cat made clear to the White House that the suffrage states, with more than 15 million women voters, now neared a majority in the Electoral College. So Wilson finally went to the Senate to appeal for the support of suffrage. But the Senate still refused to act. And so the bill had to go back to the House to be brought up again in the new biennium. Then the Senate still would defeat the bill twice, even as late as February 1919, by 1 vote. In the interim, President Wilson asked women suffragists to be patient after a century of struggle. In Wisconsin, women lost patience with state legislators when, as late as 1919, the men in Madison rejected a bill for full suffrage and backslid to only presidential suffrage, so they would not face women voters in their legislative races. And of course, the bill would be made moot by the 19th Amendment, as the state bill would not take effect until 1920 anyway. And those bills in this state also caused Cat to lose patience with Wisconsin. She had called Wisconsin hopeless and had ordered women here to only support any other state's campaigns that could win, unlike Wisconsin, and add to the electoral college counts. But again, our state legislators' compromise would become moot anyway by May. Wilson called Congress back for a special session, and Catt called women back to the Capitol. This time, in May of 1919, both Winton Youmans and Jessie Jack Hooper watched from the House galleries as the same bill that had passed the year before, passed the year before, passed again. But this time, as Winton Youmans reported to readers, women held their hallelujahs. She wrote, and I quote, "There was no excitement, no jubilee on our side. The fight had been so long, the victory had come so gradually, that it was difficult to grasp. So we filed out, smiling quietly at each other, and that was all." And that is one of the saddest of the thousands of accounts that I read by women here who had earned the right to rejoice. But by then they were only wearied by the long fight for their basic rights. 2 weeks later, in June 1919, at last, suffragists were exultant when the Senate at last passed the 19th Amendment by only 2 votes and sent it to the states. This time, Hooper had stayed in Washington to lobby to the last minute, while Winton Youmans was already back in Wisconsin and back to work on the 3rd step for ratification. Because even then, the men in our legislature could not complete their work on time, so they still were in session in Madison. Most state legislators had gone home by June, but not all. And so that Wisconsin, for so long the despair of suffragists, would become the envy of the movement at the end, owed in part to luck, but primarily to women's planning. Admittedly, again for glory was a factor for suffragists. As Winton Youmans wrote, and I quote, "We of Wisconsin have been extremely ambitious to secure for our state the honor of first state to ratify. But other states have similar ambitions." And she singled out Illinois, which she said has set her heart on being first. Those were fighting words for Wisconsinites when she slyly singled out the state that could raise the competitive state spirit even in the men in Madison. So, to give them their due, the historic ratification here also was owing to men, or to their cynical political posturing. In this, one of the most laggard of states, as our legislators now rushed to ratify, a few men in our legislature said the quiet part out loud and admitted to the press that they only voted for ratification in case it won elsewhere, because then the men would have to look good, they said, to women voters. But because the men in Madison in our legislature still debated the issue here for almost an hour, while legislatures also were in session in Illinois and Michigan, the men in this state, or excuse me, in the state to our south, actually acted first. But the Illinoisans erred in their wording, and their document would be rejected in Washington and have to be redone days later. However, in Wisconsin, as Winton Youmans wrote, women already had anticipated every detail, down to the legal language, and it passed with only 3 dissenting votes from our state legislators. Women here even had a courier ready to race the ratification document to Washington. He was the father of Ada James. He was 76 years old, and he was retired from the legislature where he had sponsored the 1912 referendum bill and where her uncle had sponsored the 1886 referendum bill. Now, David James was in Madison for the day for a reunion of Civil War veterans. So, as Ada James later wrote, and I quote, he had to commandeer her traveling bag to race by train, by car, and on foot to Washington, where women had alerted Wisconsin Senator Irvine Lenroot, a longtime supporter of suffrage. So his staff met James and raced him and a ratification document to the State Department in D.C. But then, Wisconsin women had to wait days, even weeks for word, until Winton Youmans reported to her readers that the Secretary of State in Washington, D.C. had sent official verification that on June 10, 1919, Wisconsin at last had earned first place in women's history. Now that is a paradoxical place for one of the last states still without full suffrage then. That the 19th Amendment was ratified first in Wisconsin was not a coup for this state famed for so-called progressive reform. And that was not at all what I expected to find when I began my book. I'd been taught that this was the most progressive state. But as most media and reviewers here ignored, my evidence in the book argues that this was not, and certainly is not, a progressive state for women, for whom that was a myth even then. Indeed, even in 1912, when progressivism was at its peak in Wisconsin, men here had voted suffragism down 2-1. Because when progressivism began in this state 2 decades before, women here, with loss of that first referendum in our courts, had begun to fall behind women elsewhere. And by many measures, we still are behind today. Instead, the struggle had lasted so long in this state that women still were organized in Wisconsin in suffrage organizations well after women in suffrage states, where women had won for as much as half a century, women there disbanded and had to reorganize for ratification. So that the intransigence of men here was met by women who remained organized here. That's the reason why Wisconsin made history. And the race to ratify the 19th Amendment first suggests that the honor was easily won. So it is important to remember that it first passed by only a few votes in the House, and at the end by only a few in the Senate, and that in this state, our legislators still were debating a bill for another referendum and for only partial suffrage. A bill that, based on women's history here, might not have been won. After all, every other state's suffrage organization had what women called suffrage hymns. Well, ours was the only state that I found with a suffrage fight song to the tune of On Wisconsin. As its author wrote, and I quote Winton Youmans again, "Full suffrage was won in this state only when, at length, it was taken out of the hands of the male voters of Wisconsin by the federal government." And that was still more than a year away, as women here and elsewhere could not know when or even whether the last ratification would be won. With 35 more states required for ratification, as Winton Youmans warned her readers, victory was not inevitable. And then ratification stalled, short by one state for months. And even when the last state ratified, 100 years ago today, It was won again by only one vote from a young first-term legislator who found the courage to withstand political corruption and bribery there when he found in his coat pocket a note from his mother. She wrote, and I quote, that he should be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat. For that, he would be defeated for re-election and never run for office again. And even a week and a day later, when the 19th Amendment became law at last, on August 26, 1920, there was work yet to be done to disprove the perennial cliche that women didn't really want the vote. As Winton Youmans wrote, and I quote, legislation had done for us all that it could do. Now the task was to teach women to turn out at the polls. Not that she had subscribed to the argument that women with the ballot suddenly would effect great change. Instead, she wrote, and I quote, that if women vote, they often will vote ignorantly or angrily or selfishly, just as men do. And women have the same right as men to commit these errors and to learn by them. However, they did have hope in us. So Cat took a crucial step in any successful public opinion campaign, which is to maintain support once it is won. After all, the women long had seen laws that they had won were lost again, and the 18th Amendment would be repealed. And repeal campaigns against the 19th Amendment already were underway. So, at their national convention in Chicago in 1920, on the date closest to the centennial of Susan B. Anthony's birthday, which was celebrated by women for decades then and still is today, her successor, Carrie Cat, voted to continue the work begun by Anthony and Katie Stanton more than 50 years before. And so Chapman Cat renamed their organization as the League of Women Voters. And less than a week later, in the Milwaukee Public Library, as Winton Youmans wrote, and I quote, our state's woman suffragists met in the city where women long gone also had founded the state organization in 1869. So she wrote, and I quote, that it was with a sense of sadness and yet great rejoicing that the organization was dissolved and succeeded by the Wisconsin League of Women Voters. And at last, Winton Youmans wrote, the woman suffrage movement in its truest meaning now commenced. The work continued with little change in leadership nationally and in this state, where Winton Youmans and Hooper swapped titles, not tasks. As League president, Hooper continued to lead lobbying efforts, while Winton Youmans, as first vice president, now managed a new public opinion campaign, which she called, in a new name for her Freeman column too, Good Citizenship for Women. She also took on another task as a historian, and the task of every state president as they left office, which was to leave a legacy of their state reports for the volumes of that monumental collection called The History of Women's Suffrage on how women made history. Winton Youmans also submitted that for publication in our State Historical Society's magazine as a record for us to read, and you can do so online, in the hope that we would learn from our past. The world, she knew, would not. Nor have we always heeded our foremothers and their lessons from the past on the hard work that it took to make history here. As Winton Youmans wrote, and I quote, many women and men helped in the long struggle, but it was a burning flame in the souls of a little group of women which lighted the way, because they had a profound conviction that suffrage was fundamentally right and absolutely necessary. And so she concluded, while the careless world will think that women's suffrage just happened, that it was in the air, we know that the changes in the opinions of society which made it possible are the result only of ceaseless, unremitting toil. Yet, as she feared, a generation of women would forget their heritage and the legacy of lessons handed down through the decades by our foremothers, for, as they sang, their daughters' daughters, us. Winton Youmans' history and those of thousands of other women whose words fill those 6 volumes of the record begun by Katie Stanton and Anthony, those were not rediscovered for another half century until the modern women's movement, when my generation had to relearn how to win change. And as suffragists also sang, not for ourselves alone, but for all women, because we had to relearn, as they knew well, that as long as any woman is denied her rights, all women may be next. We also had to relearn that suffrage was necessary but not sufficient, as it was only a first step to win other and equal rights. Suffragists in 1920 knew this as they continued to work for women's rights in marriage and divorce and child custody and education and income, even the basic right to jury service, to be judged by juries of our peers, and many more rights delineated in the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848, yet still not ours today, without another constitutional amendment, the ERA. In 1921, Wisconsin again became the first state with a state ERA, a historic law that made headlines nationwide as what its creator called the first Bill of Rights for women. But few of us know of it and what became of it in our legislature, unfortunately, and how what happened to our ERA here reshaped the national ERA that women suffragists introduced in 1923. That is another story that I also researched and wrote for another book in another day. For today, in the words of our first foremothers in Wisconsin, thank you again for inviting me to honor with you our foremothers and your foremothers in the League of Women Voters, for those with us here, as we celebrate this centennial of your historic first ratification of the 19th Amendment, and as we all look forward to nationwide celebrations next week of the Amendment's centennial. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I brought Vicki and myself back into the stage.
Oh, that was so wonderful.
These live streams are so difficult because we don't see the immediate audience reaction. If you want to encourage folks who are still watching, if you've got questions, drop them in the comment section. Our comments will be glad to pull them up. Our first accolade or your first accolade. Thank you for this.
Well, I would just like to quickly put out there my sincere gratitude to Dr. McBride for sharing her knowledge with us today. She makes us look good. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing with us. It was such a wonderful presentation. Thank you so, so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. I know we've got somebody with the Historic Society who's dropping some comments in. A former student of yours, Ruth Page Jones, whom herself has written on the role of Midwest women, particularly in North Dakota, in their fight for suffrage. And what struck me in the program tonight, and I guess kind of a question for you, is in approaching the work for the book and your research, you mentioned, you were taught what a progressive state Wisconsin was. Were you struck by the years of effort, and how did you go about kind of finding these very on the ground stories of the club women and things to pull their narratives back to the forefront?
Can you hear me? I got a sudden glitch.
Yeah.
Oh, good. I can't see you, but you can hear me. I'm sorry. So could you repeat the question? I was clicking around trying to fix it.
No, you're good. I was being long-winded. The short version being, how in approaching your research did you find some of the stories of the women who were lesser known? You mentioned having to rediscover them in many ways, and kind of you were taught about the Wisconsin progressive history, and yet here's all this evidence in your work that kind of refutes some of that. So what was the research like trying to pull those narratives out?
That's a good question from a good student. Hello, Ruth. Good to hear from Ruth Jones again. And thank you for arranging this tonight and handing it over to Bonnie. As Ruth knows, as historians like her know, we do have to work from the evidence.
Yeah.
The facts. We are not allowed alternative facts. And I started by deciding on this topic, which parts of it had intrigued me for years. My mother was in the League of Women Voters and told me about Theodora Youmans because my mother also was a journalist for the Milwaukee Sentinel. And then I worked at the Waukesha Freeman, as was mentioned in the intro, in the same job that Theodora Youmans had, decades, even a century before. And I thought, well, that's interesting because
there's some kismet.
I kept being told that I was the first woman in the job, and I said, no. That always sets us back. We're always told we're the first, so we should be grateful.
Yeah.
So when it came to doing graduate work at Madison, my dissertation, I had done some research and decided I would look into this. I wanted to know more about Theodora Youmans. And I crossed the street from my building there to the State Historical Society and went to its wonderful archives, some of the best in the country, and asked for anything they had on Theodora Winton Youmans. And they came back and said they had nothing.
No.
And I said, what? The most prominent woman of her time in this state? Well, I said, let me ask this. Do you have anything under Mrs. Henry Youmans? Because I had figured out that Mrs. was the most popular first name for women in the 19th century.
Yes.
And the archives hadn't updated since that time. And sure enough, we have something for Mrs. Henry Youmans. I got excited. They brought out the folder. It had 2 pieces of paper in it. One was a letter from Youmans to her mother when she served as one of our state commissioners at the St. Louis World's Fair. And another was a letter from another historian saying, do you have anything on Theodora Winton Youmans? So I puzzled away and I thought, okay, well, how about the records of the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association? And I asked for those. And they brought them out, and there's not much until the last decade and a half of the movement. And I said, but wait a minute, it was founded long before in 1869. Well, I later found out that we had had a horrible fire in our state capitol in 1906. That is where a lot of the State Historical Society's archival materials were stored, and they had burned. We lost an immense amount of state history then. So I was stumped. And I kept thinking, luckily, because I had been a journalist, and I know that some journalists, I'm really not one of them, so this question is somewhat uncomfortable. Some journalists only like to talk about themselves. And I thought, oh, wait a minute, maybe she wrote about the movement in the Freeman.
Right.
So off I went, and there it was in her weekly column, which she had started way back in the 19th century, before she married Henry, when she was there on her own. She had started a women's page on page 2, a typical thing done by newspapers then to advertise to women who were even then the primary purchasers for the homes. We do shopping well.
Right.
She had continued to do that column on until there in 1911, she becomes active in the women's suffrage movement. and she becomes out as a suffragist. Clearly, she had been one fighting as a clubwoman for the school suffrage bill in 1900, but here she really makes it public. I am part of the campaign. I am the publicist for one of the suffrage organizations working for the referendum. And so then every week, I read them all. I ended up getting bifocals before the age of 40 because of reading what eventually amounted to 100 years of newspapers on
Right.
microfilm. It's agonizing, but they're wonderful, her columns. They were interesting, though, in that I would read page 2 as Theodora Youmans is fighting for suffrage and other causes for women, and then I turn to page 4, and there's Henry Youmans, the publisher, also her husband, arguing sometimes against those causes like
Yes.
suffrage. So I said, this must have been the most fun you could find in Waukesha at the time.
To be a fly on the wall in their dining room, I think.
Go get the Freeman and read page 2 and then read page 4 for the
right.
Yes. I asked, a part of my initial research also was to contact the family genealogist, the wonderful Mim Youmans Welford.
Yeah.
I'd worked with her husband at the Freeman, and Mim is just a delight. And I said, from the genealogy, what could she tell me about the Youmans family? And she shared a lot. And then I said, okay, now I've looked at page 2 and I've looked at page 4 as they were battling against each other so often. I said, can you tell me what was going on in that marriage? And she said, of course, she was a lady and she wouldn't discuss such things in detail. But she said, let me put it this way. Uncle Henry made a lot of his own dinners.
Oh, goodness. There's an answer for you. I love that.
Oh, my goodness. That is hilarious.
But I think, too, we do so much work at Historic Society trying to facilitate researchers and working with students coming in very often from Carroll University or even at the high school level. Getting over those barriers of research is such an incredible skill, and to have the tenacity to understand, okay, my straight line question, do you have Theodora on file? No. How else do I find her? Right? If I can't get it in a straight line, I will find the alternative route around so that you can find the sources. Because they're there, but it is, and particularly women's history, as you said, Mrs. is the most popular first name.
And that's a tip for people doing online research now. Put in more search terms in your browser. I had actually learned that with my master's thesis that I did at Marquette, which was on race in this state, looking at the 1967 civil rights protests and movement. And even though I had been there then, I've been here all my life, by the 1980s when I was doing it, I'd forgotten some of the terms already. And so I went in and said, what do you have, on African Americans? Nothing. What do you have on blacks? Nothing. And I had to realize when you look at the newspapers in 1967, it tells you I had to use the term Negro to turn up a lot of information.
Knowing your time, knowing when, and getting yourself back in that headspace can be really valuable.
So in addition to the primary sources, as Ruth and others who do history here know, and this slayed my students when one of them asked when I had finally defended my dissertation, and they said, well, how many books did you have to read? And I said, well, I had to read all kinds of primary sources, the newspapers, the letters, the correspondence that I could find, the minutes that I could find. But I said, you have to read a lot of secondary sources to understand what was going on at the time, like the terms used, and understand the larger context, because references will be made in newspapers and correspondence that, may not quite be understandable. What do they mean by that? So the larger context. So I said, oh, well, when I put together the, list of references at the end of my dissertation, it was about 800 articles and books, and some students just said, that's it, I'm not doing history.
Yep. A mentor of mine in grad school said English majors have nothing on historians when it comes to a book list.
Nothing. Plus, they get to make it up. We don't get those alternatives.
Well, you said it, not me. I'm going to pull up a comment here from Mary Road. An accolade for you. Just great. Makes me feel proud of the women that came before us. Thanks for all the detail you provided. And certainly, I think that is where good history happens in the conversation we're having. It's the details. It's going in and finding the evidence and understanding where it's going to take you in the work. And then I'm going to pull up a question here. This is Ruth, even though it's under our name. But did you research all the women's club reports as well?
Did I research women's clubs? I certainly did. As a matter of fact, that was part of my initial research on Theodora Winton Youmans for a class in Madison, a wonderful class where one of my profs tipped me off that Linda Gordon, one of our foremost historians of women, was inviting Ellen Carroll Du Bois, another extraordinary historian of women nationally, internationally, inviting her to Madison to team teach a course on women reformers, 1890 to 1920. So I talked my way in, and that was quite a thing. There I was, suburban housewife, commuting to Madison from western Waukesha County after finding childcare, for the kids. And there I was, up in Madison taking my first women's history course ever, because we didn't have those when I was in college. And that gave me my mission to teach women's history and continue what women had started finally in the 1970s. So it just became so important to understand all that women had done, that detail, and how they got there. And I'll tell you a little story. I didn't quite understand the importance, the significance of the women's clubs in the suffrage movement, even when I rushed to finally defend my dissertation and graduate. Otherwise, I was going to lose my job. It was not published in Paris yet. It was dissertate or die. And so I kind of had this missing chapter. And luckily, because my committee for my dissertation was all men, they actually believed me when I wrote that, nothing much happened by women from 1890 to 1910. No woman historian would have bought that. So I defended the dissertation.
I'm thinking in my archives that might refute that, but yes.
I defended the dissertation, and then I could get back without that pressure to work on the book. So this whole project took more than 10 years. And I said, I've got to figure this out, because they had to do something right. So I went back into the sources, and you do that. You go back and back. You've read some more secondary sources. You go back into the primary sources. You see something with new eyes. And then I saw, wait a minute. The secondary sources told me we'd gotten new research since I'd started on women's clubs. And that's where the movement went. Yeah. In the 1890s until 1910, the suffragists, you were dealing with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony died or ill. Susan B. Anthony died in 1906. Carrie Chapman Catt stepped in then in 1906, but she had to leave the presidency that first time to take care of her dying husband. This first generation of suffragists, and I understand this now, they were worn out.
Yeah.
I don't have a lot of marching left in me, I'll tell you. And so the movement just kind of became more abundant, plus blows like losing that referendum result in Wisconsin. And so it was that second generation of suffragists getting into this women's club movement as it really became organized in the 1890s. Deciding to take on municipal housekeeping meant you're going to be speaking to public officials and politicians. Mm-hmm. You're going to have to figure out how the government works. I found wonderful things like what's recognized as the first club in Milwaukee was actually a club by women who wished they could have gone to college. But once Milwaukee Downer College started in 1890, they asked the professors there to meet with them weekly and teach them what these women had not been able to learn in college. And they brought in other speakers. There was a speaker I spotted called Major Robert. He was the official lighthouse keeper sent here by the federal government to the wonderful Milwaukee Lighthouse. And the lighthouse keeper, it gets kind of boring when the lake freezes over. wasn't a lot to do with the lighthouse then. Ships aren't coming in the harbor. And so Major and Mrs. Robert got talking, and she was active in a lot of clubs. And she said, we're trying to get things done with the men, but we keep getting ruled out of order, and we don't understand the rules of meetings.
Right.
How is this done? So he decided that they would sit down and write what became written here in Milwaukee, Major Robert's Rules of Order.
Yeah.
And then so the women said, please come at the Downer College meetings. Please come and teach us
Yeah.
how to make sure we never get ruled out of order again.
Right.
I learned that as a faculty member too. Learning parliamentary procedure was important if you were going to get something through the faculty senate. So
Yeah.
all those things, and that's why the History of Women's Suffrage collection by Anthony and Stanton was amazing, because it really was what I love, the how-to.
Right.
That's my thing. Some people are, as I said, intellectual journalists, and they focus on why. I mean, what's the big question here? Why? Because we want to vote. But how do you do it? How do you win change in this country? How do you win constitutional amendment campaigns, which are so complex?
Mm-hmm.
How do you do this? And you're not going to get anywhere if you don't learn the process.
Right.
Even if you're going to change the process, you've first got to learn what
You
it
got to
is.
learn the rules. Yep.
So, and
Love
to
that.
your question too, and with Theodora, the research on her got me into the Waukesha women's clubs. And I was a graduate student, single mother, 2 kids, needed money. And so one of my research papers was on the clubs in the small town that had produced her. And then I went back to the Waukesha Freeman and I said, guess what? There's an anniversary coming up of the first club, the Ideals, as I recall.
Yeah.
How would you like me to rewrite this research paper, this term paper, as a newspaper article? And they actually had me do it as a series.
Oh, nice.
We should find that, the History of Women's Club.
Yes.
I'm sure it's in the Historical Society archive.
I got it somewhere. All right. Well, I think originally we had said, we'll go about an hour tonight. I know we have gone well over, and we've still got some folks tuning in with us. So I did want to pull up the Women and Girls Fund of Waukesha County joined us tonight. So I wanted to pull them up. They're a fantastic charitable fund associated with Wisconsin or with the Waukesha County Community Foundation. The Women and Girls Fund, though, does some incredible work in town. And I know their director visited us today during our suffrage drive-through event at the museum. So they're another fantastic community organization. And really getting back to exactly what you were saying, it is sometimes the organizations, the clubs behind the scenes getting the things done.
They're amazing. Also very important, one of my longtime loves, the Waukesha Library.
Yes.
Let me tell you that all my books are there for free.
Yes, they are.
Don't worry, the royalties don't mean much to me. They're pennies when it's an academic thing. Although if you want to buy the anthology, which is designed for girls in middle school and high school, as well as college students, to make it nice and readable, more than 50 articles I excerpted and then put together to tell the whole 400-year history of women here. If you decide to buy this one for your daughters and your daughters' daughters, the proceeds, your sons, oh yes, the royalties go to the State Historical Society, not to me. Oh,
that's brilliant.
We need to support them. And please do support the Waukesha Historical Society, which I told you, Bonnie, when we met at long last, that I worked with Libby Nolan way back when I was at the Freeman, and I loved going over there. And I also said the story, I think I shared with you, of how important the local historical societies and how important we can be, the kind of change we can effect.
Yep.
It is important for girls to grow up seeing that women did important things.
Yes,
absolutely.
And the Waukesha Historical Society made that happen, because after I first spoke to you decades ago, as I still was doing the book, I think, after my article on Theodora Youmans was published in the State Historical Society magazine, and it was wonderful to get in front of people, come out from under the archives and all the crumbled bits of paper and the microfilm, and get to actually see people and see them enjoying what I was doing. I was like, thank you. So the Waukesha Historical Society was very affirmative for me. And then after my talk, the society went on to take my article and use it as evidence, and they did the hard work. They followed the process of asking that the city establish a new name for the park that was next to the Freeman when I worked there, and now it's across the street. And that's why Triangle Park became called Theodora Winton Youmans Park.
That's it.
And there are probably other places in Waukesha that have women's names, but you just know them by the last name, their husband's name, or that need to have women's names on them.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
look around, make history happen, because we need girls and women as well as boys and men to make history. We all need to do it.
Everybody's got to get involved.
We need to do it here. And the way they learn that they can do it here, they don't have to be on the East Coast. They don't have to be wearing ponytails and tights and, talk like they do in Hamilton. They don't need to rap like in Hamilton. You can make history right here, and people are doing it every day.
I love it.
And,
Our
and the
next
society
series, I
recognizes
told you
that.
that, Dr. McBride, that's our next series.
Absolutely. All right. I don't think there's a much better sign off than that. Thank you, Dr. McBride, for the program this evening. Thank you to Vicki and the League of Women Voters, Milwaukee and Waukesha counties. Again, I am Bonnie Bird, director at the Waukesha County Historic Society and Museum. If you enjoyed the program tonight, let us know. Thank you all both so very much. We'll see everybody again one day.